We'll now start our questioning, and I will start and first ask Ms. Nilsson a question. Professor Eastman stated in his written testimony that Section 2's prohibition on voting measures that have a discriminatory impact, as opposed to ones that are intentionally discriminatory, is constitutionally suspect. What's your response to that, Ms. Nilsson?
Well, my first response is that that's not the focus of this hearing, although I believe we owe a response to an inquiry that intends to lead us in a different direction. The Voting Rights Act has been upheld on multiple occasions by the Supreme Court, both Section 5 and Section 2. Section 5 was most recently clearly rubber stamped by this current court in 2013 in this Shelby County decision that all of us lament. The one thing that came out of that we can rely on for some assurance is that the court had an opportunity to say that it was unconstitutional and did not. Instead, it extended an invitation to this body to come back with a new pre-clearance formula, and that is exactly what this body has done, and I hope we will adopt that measure. In terms of the Voting Rights Act as a whole, the Supreme Court has never applied the congruence and proportionality test that Mr. Eastman suggests that came out of the city of Bernie versus Flores to legislation under the 15th Amendment. And Congress draws heavily upon the enforcement powers of the 15th Amendment in its exercise of enforcement powers in enacting the Voting Rights Act and enforcing its provisions. The court has only applied that in connection with the 14th Amendment, and in that context, the Voting Rights Act has actually been used as a beacon of what congruence and proportionality looks like, and I can cite to several cases that establish that.
And let me ask you one other thing. In his written testimony, he also said pre-clearance formally fails the congruence and proportionality test, which we were talking about with respect to Congress's authority under the 14th Amendment, implicitly importing that the test is a limitation on our 15th Amendment authority. You find that to be without basis?
Without merit, absolutely. Just to say one word about the congruence and proportionality test, what it seeks to do is ensure that when Congress enacts legislation, it is seeking to remedy and deter congressional violations and not create new constitutional rights. And that's precisely what the Voting Rights Act does. It is seeking to remedy violations that many of us here on this panel have identified and that have already put into the record. It seeks to deter those constitutional violations by ensuring that there's pre-clearance and federal oversight of voting changes. It does not in any way alter the fundamental right to vote that the Supreme Court established back in 1886 as preservative of all rights.
And do you happen to know the history in 1965 Act that when Section 5 was first passed, what the history was on that and why they felt that was necessary?
Well, the history in 1965 came on the heels of a bloody and violent protest for the right to vote. Congresswoman Sewell mentioned earlier the very tragic events in her hometown of Selma that gave rise to the Voting Rights Act. And that was really just the culmination of decades of violence visited upon African Americans who dared to exercise their citizenship through the political process.
And most of those states that were in that formula were in the Old South. And you mentioned some states in your testimony where you had litigation. And they were Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and there might have been another one, but I think that's got it.
Missouri, and yeah, but that was not covered by Section 5. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, but then they joined the SEC, so in essence they admitted they probably should have been there. It's a sports thing. Did not the states that were chosen pretty much mirror the problems that have existed in our nation with civil rights laws that have tried to inhibit people's right to vote?
So back in 1965, the states that were covered under Section 5 were states with some of the most virulent histories of racial discrimination in voting. There were others that ultimately came to be covered under Section 5, including my home state of New York and New York City, portions of the city that engaged in racial discrimination.
But they did a pretty good job. I mean, we've limited time, so I want to ask Professor Kauser, who's the statistics pro. Pretty much, you showed where most of the cases have been brought were in those jurisdictions which were covered by the pre-clearance requirement. Give us a little flesh on those, the bones of that.
Yes, that's true. Also, the 70 and 75 laws were important. About 20% of the instances come from Texas, which wasn't covered in the original 65 Act.
They were in the Southwest Conference.
That's true. It's interesting, if you look at cases from 57 to 65, there were states that were covered by the 65, by Section 4 under 65, that had no cases from 57 to 65. Both of the Carolinas, Virginia, no cases during that period of time. Congress knew where the voting restrictions were, but they weren't necessarily exactly where cases had been brought. Now we've got a lot more experience. We've got all this experience from 1957 through 2019 in my tables and database, which will be available for the committee to look at if they want to figure out what practices and where they are. And we know much more fully than people did in 1965 exactly where voting practices which have been adjudicated to be illegal or were parts of settlements or parts of objections. We know exactly where they were. So if Congress wants to base something on that, it has a much fuller legislative record than they had in 65.
Thank you, Professor. Recognize Mr. Johnson for questioning.